Good morning. At least it's morning for me. I hope it's a good time for you. This is week 3, audio 1, for the first lecture. And this week we're going to be talking about the anti-Japanese war and the Chinese Civil War that followed. We'll be covering the years 1937 to 1949. Let's go on to slide 3. So, I won't dwell on this, but I've found through personal experience that this statement made by the Australian journalist Richard Hughes is sadly true. The long-standing antipathy of the peoples of Northeast Asia toward each other is real and, for the moment, undying in its intensity. When you travel there, you will find that out if you take the time to just talk to people about it. It's something that needs to be understood and appreciated, and part of understanding and appreciating this is to understand the history that brought it about. So let's go on to slide 4. Now I want to start off briefly reviewing what happened in Korea right after the two wars that made a difference that we've already reviewed very briefly are the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-5 and the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, a decade later. One reason why Japan employed such brutal policies in China that we're about to examine and are at the root of the antipathy between the Japanese and Chinese people today was that these policies were tried out by the Japanese with great success in Korea several decades before. They worked on a small scale in Korea. The country was subdued, in the short term anyway. The Japanese eventually made efforts to erase Korea's culture when there was continued resistance, however, over the course of the following years. In 1919, some people in the elite even tried on March the 1st, 1919, to declare independence of Korea. But that didn't work. There was no armed force or popular uprising to back it up, but March the 1st is still celebrated as a holiday in Korea today. During the decades, or really the years, that followed Japan's full takeover of Korea in 1905, I won't list them all, but they're here on this slide for you to see. And these various steps, such as terrorizing the population, the burn all, rape all, loot all policy that was tried out first in Korea in 1907-08 and was later applied in China after the capture of Nanking or Nanjing. Unfortunately, these main aspects of Japanese policy in China had been road-tested, if you will, in Korea beforehand with tragic consequences on a smaller scale, and the Japanese felt that they could continue, it seems, to use them to great effect in China. And indeed, at first, they were successful. However, China is a much larger country. They were doing all this on a much larger scale, but with the same size army, and ultimately this would be the downfall of the Japanese. Let's go on to slide 5. So in the Taylor book and in last week's lectures, you learned about the popular anger directed against Chiang Kai-shek, Jiang Jieshi, as he's known in Chinese, Chiang Kai-shek. I say CKS throughout these slides because it's easy. There was popular anger directed against Chiang Kai-shek for not mounting earlier military resistance to Japan in the 1930s as they took over Manchuria, turned it into a puppet state, and as their armies gradually spread southward, bit by bit and row by row, into northern China. By the time the Marco Polo Bridge incident occurred in July of 1937, the Japanese army, the IJA, the Imperial Japanese Army, was on the outskirts of Beijing. Indeed, they were in the present-day suburbs of Beijing. You can take a taxi ride from central Beijing today out to the Marco Polo Bridge in about 30 or 40 minutes if the traffic is not horrible. So Chiang Kai-shek had held back from resisting Japan because he knew his forces would be unable to resist a determined Japanese attack. How did he know this? Well, he knew what his forces consisted of. His forces were, for the most part, light infantry. The typical Chinese division was not fully armed. That is, every soldier did not have a rifle. They did not have artillery support, and his air force was almost non-existent. The Japanese, by contrast, had fewer soldiers at hand in China. However, they were very well armed, very well trained, and they had all that fire and maneuver support that you would need to mount a successful attack. However, in the previous 2.5 years, the KMT had a German military advisor named von Falkenhausen, and he believed at this point in time when the Marco Polo incident occurred that the KMT's elite German armed divisions, they were partly German armed anyway, there were only a few of them, might be able to hold against a Japanese attack. However, the plan that they had in motion to fully arm 60 divisions in a modern sense with artillery and to build up an air force that could support them was only in its first stages. It had another 2 years to go before scheduled completion, and you know how those things go. Great plans made to do lots of things with expensive implements, they often get postponed. Even if the Chinese had 2 more years to modernize their forces, the Japanese would have observed this, of course. There would have been inevitable delays, not related to Japan, but just related to getting these things done. And I often wonder whether, even if the Chinese had 3 or 4 more years to build up before the Japanese finally attacked, and total war ensued between the two sides, whether there would have been any possibility of China holding out. But that's not something we can really ever determine. Let's go on to slide 6. On slide 6, we're talking about the initial cooperation that had occurred between the nationalists and the communists. The two sides, after the Xi'an incident only months earlier in December of 1936, the two sides negotiated a great deal. As mentioned last week, Zhou Enlai flew back and forth between Nanjing and the northwest, in Bao'an, where he was, where the communist movement was ensconced. But there was no good agreement between them on how to arrange military subordination and political continuation of the two sides as they were to unite to fight the Japanese, or to prepare to fight the Japanese anyway. And the Japanese had noticed, of course, what was going on. They had their spies, they had their they read the newspapers, and they could see that if they waited much longer, then it would be harder to carry forth their program of taking over China, at least down to the Yangtze River, the Changjiang, the Yangtze River, China's great east-west waterway. And so it was not as if, however, to back up a moment, that the Marco Polo Bridge was the beginning of a determined Japanese attack. The Japanese were actually mulling over what to do, both in their military councils and their political, amongst the political leadership. And the Marco Polo Bridge incident was actually a bit of an accident, where both sides, at first, the commanders on the scene apologized and withdrew their forces. However, their superiors were less interested in compromise, as we discussed last week, and things got out of hand. But once the war started, both sides were determined to fight as hard as they could, because they'd been preparing for this for a long time, and each side knew that the other was determined to defeat it. At first, the Chinese communists and nationalists cooperated to some extent. This was at the point where there was very little behind the lines activity like there would be later, when the Japanese became overextended. And supposedly, there was decent cooperation for the first months of the conflict. Let's go on to slide 7. However, there were contradictions, inherent contradictions, and lots of mistrust between the two sides that soon caused trouble. Clashes between forces of the communists and the nationalists began almost immediately. The political leadership on both sides tried to keep this under control at first, because the leadership on both sides wanted cooperation in the desperate situation that was developing. However, things did not work out very well, and by 1941, the alliance was all but ended in a formal sense. And the guerrillas that would meet behind the lines, now that Japan was becoming overextended as the Pacific War opened and Japan withdrew forces to go fight the Americans, the gaps that developed behind the Japanese lines, which were filled in by guerrillas from both sides, were often the scene of fighting between the Chinese forces, as Chinese killed Chinese in spite of the fact that their country was occupied by foreign power. Going on to slide 8, one thing that people often forget when they look at the difficulties of the nationalist regime is how many people they lost. Not only soldiers, but also huge numbers of civilians. The Japanese war machine was droned on, and the casualties taken by the KMT Army, by the Nationalist Army, were enormous. They lost 30,000 officers alone, and this one fact, losing so many well-trained individuals, was almost by itself a decisive factor in the civil war that would follow a decade later. Because these were the, I don't want to use a cliche, but these were the people who were less corrupt, they were highly trained, they were educated individuals. They would have been the mainstay of a more effective army to fight the communists after World War II had they survived, but they died in very large numbers. If you know anybody in the military, they can tell you about how lieutenants and captains die in very large numbers in any army that is at war, because they've always got to be sticking their heads up and directing things, and they become easy targets. As well, there were tragic events, including 500,000 deaths in north-central China, when Chun Li-Fu, we must give him credit, one of the Chun brothers, he and his brother became known as the CC clique, Chun Li Fu, who was at this time in charge of the police and all the secret services, came up with the brilliant idea of breaking the Yellow River dikes in north-central China, in Henan, Hebei, in order to block the Japanese advance toward Wuhan, right in the middle of China, where the nationalists had moved their capital after Nanking fell. Wuhan was only the capital for a few months, and after that the nationalists had to retreat further up the Yangtze River to Chongqing or Chongqing. There was a famine that followed that event, and throughout China, as the Japanese occupied the area and brought their terrible policies to bear, countless people were tortured and killed simply for being in the way. As well, of course, the war took a very heavy toll on urban areas and other aspects of the society at the time. Going on to slide 9. The Japanese decided that they did not want to negotiate with Chiang Kai-shek anymore. They could see that he was throwing soldiers at them in large numbers, and they realized that there were lots of these soldiers still to come. So they decided to create their own government. And as was mentioned a few slides ago, there was a precedent for this in Korea, and they decided to follow through and create their own government using Wang Jingwei, who you may recall was the principal political rival of Chiang Kai-shek in the 1920s and into the early 30s, and who headed a peace faction, you might call them, a peace faction. I think that's what they're called in the Taylor book, actually, that favored negotiation with Japan in order to avoid war. In 1938, Wang Jingwei effectively left the Kuomintang. He moved to an area that was under control of the Japanese, but he did not actually become a traitor in the formal sense until the next year, when Japan began to construct his regime and his name became publicly associated with the Japanese. And in I think it was actually 1940 when the regime was formally established. The KMT started a highly successful assassination campaign in Shanghai after that, which terrorized the Wang Jingwei regime. And it's interesting, just very quickly, that collaborators with that regime got off light after the war. There was a decision made by Chiang Kai-shek, in other words, to not try to prosecute the large number of individuals who sided with Japan. Going on to slide 10, a little bit of detail of one of these plots that was later not really made into a movie, but highly fictionalized account was made in the movie Lust, Caution, that's listed here. Interestingly, the assassination attempt in the movie happened outside of the Siberian Fur Store in Shanghai, which is the site of the attempted shooting by this woman, Zheng Pingru, of Dingmo Cun, who is the head of the secret services for the Wang Jingwei puppet government. There were, like I say, 150 recorded assassinations by the KMT during this period, and the movie is intended to depict an attempted comeback by the KMT after all their people had been rounded up and executed in 1941. The movie is actually set in 1942-43, that time period. We'll stop here for this recording and go on to slide 11.